What if the cure was more terrifying than the disease? Imagine a world where the only anesthetic was a strap of leather to bite on. A world where surgeons believed burning your flesh with a red-hot iron was a vital healing step, and pus oozing from a wound was a sign of success. Why would they drill a hole into a conscious patient's skull to cure a headache? This wasn't a horror story. This was cutting-edge medieval surgery. These weren't madmen, but doctors using the best knowledge they had. We are about to count down the 10 procedures they performed that will make your skin crawl. The question isn't just what they did, but how anyone managed to survive. Fact 1. Medieval surgeons possessed a machine of terror to mend the broken body. It was a vision born from the darkest corners of a dungeon. A sprawling frame of dark, aged wood, studded with iron gears and thick, coiled ropes. Known as the glossocomion, its purpose was not to extract a confession, but to force a shattered bone back into alignment. The patient, slick with the cold sweat of fear, would be laid upon this altar of healing, their wrists and ankles swallowed by stiff leather straps. The air would grow thick with the scent of old wood, sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of the surgeon's tools. There was no comfort offered, no gentle word to soothe the coming storm. Only the grim, focused silence of the barber surgeon and his assistants as they took their positions. They were not executioners, yet their work required a similar dispassion, a willingness to inflict profound pain in service of a greater, more uncertain outcome. The first turn of the winch would send a shudder through the wooden frame, a low groan of stressed timber that was soon answered by the patient's sharp intake of breath. The ropes, thick as a man's thumb, would begin to draw taut, stretching the body with an inexorable, inhuman force. How could a device that so perfectly mirrored an instrument of torture be considered a tool of recovery? What level of desperation led a person to willingly submit to a machine designed to pull them apart? The answer lay in the alternative: a life of agonizing disability, a limb twisted into a useless shape, or the creeping, dark tendrils of gangrene that promised a far slower and more gruesome end. This was the terrifying calculus of medieval medicine, where the cure had to be more violent than the affliction. The genius of the glossocomion was its cruelty. The pattern of expectation is broken here, for the machine's role is reversed. It was not a rack for breaking bodies, but for forcibly reassembling them. The surgeon, in this moment, ceased to be a healer in any gentle sense of the word. He became a master of mechanics, applying brutal, calculated force to defy the body's own ruin. The patient's screams were not a sign of failure, but the very sound of the machine at work, the necessary soundtrack to a brutal restoration. As the tension reached its zenith, a dull, sickening pop would echo through the room, the sound of the bone surrendering, forced back into its proper place. For a moment, the screaming would cease, replaced by ragged, exhausted sobs. The surgeon had won, but the patient, lying limp and pale, was a battlefield. The bone was aligned, but the muscles were torn, the ligaments strained to their breaking point, and the spirit battered by a tide of agony. The line between being saved and being utterly destroyed had been stretched as taut as the machine's ropes. And the true healing was a war that had only just begun. Fact 2. The battlefield surgeon's most dreaded task was not closing a wound, but extracting what the enemy had left inside. In the mud-soaked aftermath of a battle, amidst the cries of the dying, a soldier's survival often hinged on a single, terrifying procedure. The initial impact of the arrow was a stunning, fiery blow. But the true agony began as the shock receded, leaving behind a pain that pulsed with every beat of the heart. Lodged deep in the flesh, the arrow was no longer a simple piece of wood and iron. It became a venomous serpent, its barbed head a set of fangs that bit deeper with every twitch of a muscle, every ragged breath. To simply pull on the shaft would be an act of butchery, the barbs tearing indiscriminately through muscle, sinew, and arteries, unleashing a fatal torrent of blood. The arrival of the surgeon offered a flicker of hope that was almost immediately extinguished by the grim reality of his work. He was no clean physician, but a man spattered in the filth of combat, his unwashed hands and iron tools promising only a new dimension of pain. His first act was to probe the wound with his fingers, a shockingly intimate and agonizing exploration of the damage within. What grim choices raced through the surgeon's mind as he felt the cold, hard reality of the embedded barb? How could this serpent be drawn from its fleshy lair without killing its host in the process? The expectation was for a larger cut, for the surgeon to carve a path of retreat for the arrowhead. But the most experienced surgeons knew a shocking and counterintuitive truth, a technique that reversed the very logic of healing. The safest path was not backward, but forward. The soldier's brief moment of hope would curdle into a new kind of horror as he realized the surgeon was not pulling, but pushing, driving the arrow deeper into his body. The surgeon's status shifted from a desperate rescuer to a willing instrument of further violence, his hands guiding the enemy's weapon on a new, invasive journey through healthy tissue. The arrow itself underwent a role reversal. From a static piece of shrapnel to an active participant in its own removal, carving a clean exit wound. A muffled scream, a final, agonizing push, and the dark, bloodied point of the arrowhead would burst through the skin on the far side of the limb. With a quick snip of iron shears, the head was removed, and the now smooth shaft could be slid back out. The serpent was gone. But as the soldier stared at the two weeping holes puncturing his body, a new, cold dread would set in. The surgeon had won the battle against the arrow. But in doing so, he had opened two new doors for a far more silent and invisible enemy to enter the bloodstream. For the wounded soldier, the sight of his own bloodied hands was a terrifying confirmation that the surgeon's intervention was not an end to his ordeal, but the beginning of a second, and far more intimate, battle for his life. Fact 3. To save a patient from a world of darkness, the medieval surgeon first had to plunge them into the very heart of terror. For the person whose vision was slowly being stolen by the milky white ghost of a cataract, life was a descent into a featureless purgatory. The world, once vibrant and sharp, would dissolve into a pale, uniform haze, rendering them helpless, a burden, and utterly isolated. It was a slow, living burial. Into this suffocating silence came the itinerant eye surgeon, a figure who offered a terrible, almost Faustian bargain. A chance to see again, in exchange for a moment of unimaginable horror. The patient would be held immobile, their head locked in a vice-like grip by strong assistance. The world would narrow to a single point of focus, the glint of the approaching needle. It could be a sharpened thorn, a sliver of bronze, or a polished iron awl. But in that moment, it was the most terrifying object on earth. The surgeon's hands, often unwashed, would pry the eyelids open, and the patient could only stare, frozen, as the point touched the surface of their eye. The sensation was not a sharp pain, but a sickening, invasive pressure, a violation at the most profound level. The world, already a blur, would explode into a chaotic dance of light and shadow as the needle pushed through the cornea, swimming in the fluid of the eye. A cold, alien presence in a sacred space. Why would any sane person submit to this? Because the alternative was the certainty of endless night. The surgeon's needle, for all its terror, was the only key that could potentially unlock the prison of blindness. The audience expects a delicate, precise extraction, a careful removal of the clouded lens. But this was not the surgeon's goal. In a shocking reversal of medical logic, the surgeon's intent was not to repair, but to break. With a firm, steady push, he would find the opaque lens and deliberately sever the delicate ligaments that held it in place, dislocating it completely. The cataract was not removed. It was sunk, pushed down into the viscous fluid at the bottom of the eyeball, where, if all went well, it would rest for the remainder of the patient's life. The surgeon's status changed from a restorer to a strategic destroyer, breaking one part of the eye to save the whole. For a breathtaking moment after the needle was withdrawn, a miracle might occur. Light, shapes, and the blurry faces of the assistants would rush back into the patient's world. A rebirth into the land of the living. But the dislodged lens, now an unsecured object, could float back into view. Or worse, fester into a catastrophic infection that brought a new, more agonizing kind of darkness. The boundary between a world restored and a world lost forever was as thin as the edge of the surgeon's needle. Fact 4. For an ailment that was notoriously common and agonizing, the medieval cure was a journey into a special kind of hell, offering a choice between fire and the blade. Hemorrhoids were a miserable, undignified affliction, a constant source of pain that could make even the simple act of sitting a form of torture. For those whose suffering became unbearable, the barber surgeon offered a set of solutions, each more terrifying than the last. The most direct, and by far the most brutal, was the application of the cautery iron. The patient would be forced to bend over, held down as the surgeon retrieved a specially shaped iron from the glowing coals of a brazier. In the dim, suffocating room, the tool itself would seem alive, its tip radiating a shimmering, malevolent heat. The sensory experience was an absolute assault. The sharp, venomous hiss as the iron met moist flesh, the immediate and sickening plume of smoke carrying the smell of vaporized blood and scorched tissue, and the pain. The pain was a white-hot nova that obliterated all other sensations. A wave of pure, searing agony that felt less like a medical procedure and more like a punishment from a wrathful God. But what if one refused the fire? What hope was there for the patient who could not face the glowing iron? The surgeon had other methods. There were sharp hooks to snag and tear the swollen veins from their place, and keen-edged knives to meticulously slice them away. This presents what seems to be a choice, a path of lesser pain. The hope for a more humane treatment even seemed to find its champion in the famed 14th-century surgeon John of Ardern, a man celebrated for his skill and advanced techniques. Here, the expectation of progress is violently subverted. Ardern's sophisticated method, which avoided the cautery iron, was no gentle cure. He advocated for carefully dissecting the affliction with a scalpel and tying it off with a silk ligature, a procedure performed with the patient fully conscious, held down and biting on a leather strap to muffle their screams. The surgeon's role, even when played by the most celebrated practitioner of the age, was not to alleviate pain, but to manage it. The choice was an illusion. It was not a choice between brutality and gentleness, but merely a choice in the character of the agony one would endure. The patient was left trembling and bleeding, the original affliction replaced by the fresh, raw trauma of the cure. They were left with an open, weeping, and often burnt wound in the one part of the body where contamination was absolutely guaranteed. The surgeon's fire had only served to prepare the ground for the much slower, colder fire of a fatal infection. Fact 5. The single most common medical treatment in the medieval world was not a complex surgery but a simple, deadly mistake, performed on nearly every patient for nearly every ailment. It was the practice of bloodletting, an act so deeply embedded in the medical mind that to question it was to question the very nature of the human body. The entire foundation of medicine rested on the elegant but fatally flawed theory of the four humors. Every person was a delicate balance of four internal fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sickness, therefore, was never a foreign invader, but always an internal imbalance, a surplus of one humor that threw the entire system into chaos. And since blood was the most visible, the most vibrant, and the easiest humor to access, it was almost always identified as the culprit. The sensory experience of a phlebotomy was one of quiet, creeping dread. The patient, already frail and pale from fever, would lie listlessly as the surgeon prepared his tools. There was no struggle, only a weary resignation. The surgeon, with a calm and practiced hand, would slice open a vein in the crook of the arm, and the patient would watch, detached, as their own life force, a stream of dark crimson, flowed steadily into a brass bowl. The air would slowly fill with the faint, coppery smell of blood as the warmth drained from the patient's limbs, replaced by a growing coldness, a lightheadedness that threatened to pull them down into darkness. How could a procedure that so obviously weakened the sick be considered a cure? How could this draining of vitality be seen as an act of restoration? The answer lay in the terrifying power of a flawed idea. The visual evidence was undeniable, the bowl filling with what the doctor and patient both believed to be the sickness itself. But the true horror of the practice is revealed in its intended outcome. The surgeon's goal was not to remove a small, symbolic amount. The pattern interrupt is not one of violence, but of chilling misinterpretation. The surgeon would continue the draining until the patient, their body screaming for oxygen, fainted. This loss of consciousness, a clear and dangerous sign of hemorrhagic shock, was grotesquely seen as the moment of triumph. It was the definitive proof that the body, finally purged of its poisonous excess, had been shocked back into equilibrium. The surgeon's role shifted from a simple practitioner to an arbiter of balance, and the patient's collapse was his victory. In their quest to restore the delicate harmony of the body, medieval doctors were methodically draining the very life from their patients, one drop at a time. Fact 6. For an internal agony that drove people to the edge of madness, the only available cure was a terrifying public spectacle performed by traveling showmen. The pain of bladder stones was a relentless, grinding misery, a fire in the core of the body that never ceased. When the suffering became too great, a desperate patient would seek out the lithotomist, a specialist surgeon who moved from town to town, his reputation preceding him like a storm cloud. This was not a private, dignified procedure. It was often performed in the open, in a town square or on a makeshift stage, for a crowd of morbidly curious onlookers. The patient, stripped bare and humiliated, would be brought to a chair, their arms and legs forcibly held by several strong assistants. The surgeon, often a flamboyant figure, would display his tools, a sharp knife and a brutal-looking metal hook called a crotchet. The sensory experience was one of complete violation. The patient's legs would be forced upwards and apart, held in a position of total helplessness as the surgeon made his approach. The first touch was the cold, sharp line of the knife, making a deep incision in the perineum, between the genitals and the anus. Then came the hook, a cold, unyielding probe searching blindly deep within the body, scraping against bone and soft tissue in its frantic quest for the stone. What kind of person could perform such an act? And who would dare to endure it? The stonecutters were a rare and secretive breed, guarding their lightning-fast techniques because their very lives and livelihoods depended on them. For the patient, they represented the final, terrifying gateway between a life of unending pain and the possibility of peace. The audience expects that such a dangerous internal surgery would require immense care, precision, and time. This expectation is shattered by the brutal reality of the procedure. The lithotomist's single most prized skill, the virtue upon which his entire fame rested, was not precision, but savage, breathtaking speed. A patient could only endure this level of absolute world-ending agony for a minute or two at most before their body would succumb to shock or catastrophic blood loss. Therefore, the surgeon's role was reversed from a careful healer into a human buzzsaw, a frantic butcher whose only goal was to get in, retrieve the stone, and get out in a matter of seconds. In a flash of brutal motion, the stone would be hooked, wrenched free, and held aloft for the cheering crowd to see. The surgeon had succeeded, but the patient, now likely unconscious from the pain, was left with a deep, ragged wound in the most septic area of the human body. Surviving the surgeon's hook was only the first act of the play, and the slow, creeping poison of infection was already waiting in the wings. Fact 7. To stand against the unstoppable tide of a fatal hemorrhage, the medieval surgeon wielded a power as elemental and as terrifying as fire itself. In a world that did not understand the intricate web of arteries and veins, a deep, open wound was a death sentence. As the patient's life force poured out, staining the floorboards a dark, terrifying crimson, the surgeon had only one recourse, one brutal and absolute answer: the cautery iron. This was not a subtle instrument. It was a thick wand of iron, heated in the glowing heart of a brazier until it shone with a hungry orange light. As the surgeon approached the patient, this tool seemed less like an instrument of healing and more like a malevolent eye, a singular point of burning intensity that promised a pain beyond comprehension. The sensory experience of its application was a symphony of horror. There was the sound, an explosive, violent hiss as 1,000 degrees of heat met living, bleeding tissue. It was a sizzle of destruction and preservation. the sound of the body being simultaneously saved and annihilated. Then came the smell, a thick, acrid plume of smoke carrying the scent of burnt hair and seared flesh, a smell that clung to the room like a death shroud. And finally, the pain. It was a pure, white-hot agony that consumed everything. A wave of fire that burned away fear, hope, and even the memory of a life before this single, all-encompassing moment of suffering. Why would a healer employ such a barbaric tool? Because it was brutally, undeniably effective. It sealed the weeping vessels, arrested the flow of blood, and pulled the patient back from the brink of death. It was a terrible, necessary magic. The true, insidious horror of cauterization, however, was not in the initial application, but in the healing that followed. Days later, the surgeon would inspect the blackened, weeping burn. He would find it oozing a thick, creamy, yellow-white pus. Here, the logic of medicine takes a terrifying turn. This foul discharge, a clear and unambiguous sign of a raging, life-threatening infection, was not seen as a crisis. In a shocking reversal of a healer's purpose, the surgeon would look upon this decay and see a triumph. He called it laudable pus. He believed this viscous fluid was the physical manifestation of the body's evil humors being successfully expelled, a vital and welcome part of the healing process. He would see death and call it life. The very tool that had saved the patient from a quick and bloody end had simultaneously created a perfect, oxygen-deprived wasteland of dead tissue, inviting a slower and far more agonizing death from the creeping blackness of gangrene. Fact 8. There exists a procedure so fundamentally violent, so visually arresting in its brutality, that it has become the enduring nightmare of pre-modern medicine. This was the amputation, the final terrifying verdict, when a limb was too crushed to be saved, or when the black tide of gangrene began its inexorable march up the body. For the patient, it was a choice made in the crucible of desperation, to sacrifice a part of themselves in a desperate gamble to save the whole. The scene was one of grim, focused preparation. The patient, their eyes wide with terror, would be given a large swig of crude alcohol and a thick leather strap to bite down upon. Then, the assistants, strong men with hardened faces, would take their positions, their only job to become human shackles, pinning the patient to the table against the coming storm of agony. The surgeon would lay out his tools, a long, sharp knife for the flesh and the saw for the bone. The sensory experience was an onslaught of pure horror, dominated by sound. First, the wet, slicing sound of the knife circling the limb, cutting cleanly down to the bone in a matter of seconds. Then, the most dreadful sound of all, the grating, rhythmic rasp of the saw blade biting into living bone, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards, a sound of frantic, violent severance. The surgeon would work in a state of hyper-focused fury, his body a blur of motion, his face spattered with a grim mixture of blood and bone dust. The natural assumption is that a procedure so permanent, so life-altering, must be performed with the utmost care and precision. This assumption is violently incorrect. In a shocking reversal of surgical values, the most revered amputation specialists were not the most careful, but the fastest. The surgeon's role was transformed from a healer into a high-speed executioner. His success measured not in clean cuts, but on the clock. A good surgeon could remove a leg in 2 minutes. A master, a legend of the craft, could do it in less than 30 seconds. This blinding speed was not for show, it was the only form of mercy the surgeon could provide. It was a desperate, bloody race against the crippling power of surgical shock and the overwhelming agony that could stop a patient's heart. The climax was a sickening crack as the bone finally severed, and the limb, a moment ago a part of a person, would fall to the floor with a heavy, wet thud. Without pausing for breath, the surgeon would grab the glowing cautery iron to seal the weeping stump. The patient would finally be released, awakening hours later into a new and terrifying reality, forever maimed and confronting the near certainty of a deadly infection brewing deep within their cauterized wound. Fact 9. There was a surgical procedure so steeped in tragedy and so driven by faith that its terror was of a different kind entirely, a quiet horror born not of a patient's screams, but of a profound and somber silence. This was the cesarean section, an operation that was almost never performed on a living woman, as to do so was to condemn her to a certain agonizing death. Its place in the medieval world was not in the realm of the living, but on the grim borderland between life and what lay beyond. The sensory experience was not one of violent, chaotic pain, but of suffocating grief. Imagine a birthing chamber, a room that should have been filled with cries of joy, now shrouded in the stillness of death. A young mother lies on the bed, her body still warm, but her life extinguished by the cruel realities of childbirth. Her family weeps silently. Into this sacred space of sorrow steps not a frantic surgeon, but often a priest or midwife, their face a mask of grim determination. Their task was not just medical. It was a holy and urgent mandate. Why would they commit this final violation on a body that had already suffered so much? The answer lay in the unshakable grip of theological doctrine. The Church taught that an unbaptized soul could not enter the kingdom of heaven. If a mother died while the child was still believed to be alive in her womb, a terrible clock began to tick. The child had to be freed and baptized before its own life slipped away, securing its place in paradise. For this entire series, the central conflict has been the conscious, terrified patient on the table. But here, that pattern is broken in the most profound way possible. The patient, the mother, is already dead. In a stunning reversal of purpose, the surgeon's knife is not wielded to save the body it cuts. The operation is for an unseen patient, a life still held within a life that has ended. The surgeon's goal is not to preserve a mortal existence, but to ensure an eternal one. The scalpel becomes an instrument of salvation, and the surgery itself is transformed from a medical act into a final, desperate sacrament. In the hushed room, the incision is made, a quiet, surreal act of trespass that separates mother and child one last time. All eyes are fixed on the surgeon's hands as they reach into the stillness, searching for a flicker of life. The surgeon's task was to pull a fragile, new soul from the cold, final embrace of death itself. Fact 10. We arrive at the absolute pinnacle of medieval surgical terror. A procedure aimed not at a limb or a diseased organ, but at the very throne of consciousness, the human skull. This was trepanning, the deliberate and calculated act of drilling a hole into the head of a living, breathing, and fully aware patient. It was a journey into the last frontier of the body, an act of breathtaking audacity and terrifying ignorance. The patient would be held immobile, their world shrinking to the small, claustrophobic space around their head. The surgeon would select his tool, perhaps a simple auger drill or a circular saw known as a trephine. The sensory experience of this procedure was an intimate violation unlike any other. It began with the sound, a low, gritty, scraping noise, like stone grinding on stone. It was a slow, rhythmic, and inescapable sound happening mere inches from the patient's ear. Worse than the sound was the sensation, a deep, resonant vibration that would travel from the point of the drill through the entire skull, buzzing in the teeth and echoing down the spine. It was the feeling of one's own body, the very vessel of the soul, being unmade. Why was such a nightmarish act ever considered a cure? To the medieval mind, the skull was a sealed vessel. Ailments like blinding migraines, violent epileptic seizures, or the chaotic visions of madness were diagnosed as a pressure building within that vessel. Sometimes it was a physical pressure, but more often it was a spiritual one, an evil humor or a literal demon trapped inside, clawing to get out. The logic was as simple as it was horrifying. To fix the problem, you had to open the box. The common assumption is that this was simply a brutal, primitive surgery, a desperate attempt to relieve a physical ailment. But the true purpose, and the procedure's greatest twist, is revealed in what happened to the piece of bone that was removed. This small, circular disc of skull, called the rondel, was not discarded. In a stunning reversal of roles, this piece of the patient's own head, the artifact of their torture, was transformed into a holy relic. The patient's status changed from a passive victim to an active wielder of magic. They would wear this piece of their own skull on a string around their neck, believing it to be a powerful amulet that would protect them from the very spirits the hole had just released. It is here, at the very peak of our countdown, that we find the ultimate symbol of this lost era of medicine. The patient is left with a permanent hole in their head, a new and macabre piece of jewelry, and the memory of the grinding drill. It was a terrifyingly brutal and invasive act, born of a profound and near-total ignorance of the human body, yet driven by the most powerful and unshakable human desire of all, the need to be healed, no matter the cost.